Welcome to Direction Northeast. Hello, I'm Chris Mitchell. This program is a presentation of the Mass Communications Department of Northeast State Community College and is produced by students through the college's video production facilities. This series of programs is designed to bring you the student perspective on events and happenings throughout Northeast Tennessee. The program is a part of the classroom and laboratory learning process for students in broadcasting and advertising public relations, part of the mass communications area. This edition of Direction Northeast is about an author who claims the Beatles nearly destroyed rock and roll. Join us in just a moment when we talk with author Elijah Wald.
Northeast State's a wonderful place to start your career in college, and the campus is beautiful, the teachers are one-on-one.
It was an excellent decision to come to Northeast State. I've learned so much coming here.
I love the school, and everyone is friendly here. This has been the best time of my life. I have really enjoyed being here.
I think if it hadn't have been for Northeast, then I wouldn't feel as happy and as driven if I chose another school.
Step by step, Northeast State is here to get you there. Enroll now at northeaststate.edu.
Elijah Wald has written for the Boston Globe for over 10 years and has written several books about popular music. He wrote a biography of bluesman Robert Johnson and most recently wrote a book entitled How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll. Mr. Wald, welcome to Direction Northeast.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's no problem. Now, let's get into this. Your book on How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll has a subtitle, An Alternative History of American Rock Music.
American popular music.
American popular music. Why is there a need? Is there a need for an alternative history?
Boy, I suppose the simple answer is I needed to write one. Whether anyone needed to publish one, you'd have to ask my publisher. I mean, it's really a project I took on because I wanted to learn what was in it. I come from a background in blues, roots music, world music, and it just began bothering me that I didn't really know the mainstream. And so really, I took on this project in order to learn what the mainstream looked like. It ended up being alternative because what I thought the mainstream looked like turned out to be very, very different than what I had expected after reading other pop music histories. So, you know, and I mean, some other people felt the same way about it when they read it.
What did you expect going in?
I expected the narrative that we're used to seeing, that, you know, sort of ragtime turns into jazz, jazz gets up into the big bands, then we have this dark age of schlock from about 1945 to 1955, from which Elvis and Chuck Berry rescue us, and then the 60s is the 60s. And I guess I had sort of a different perspective on it because I started out as a working musician. And so I'm just very conscious of the fact that, you know, you can divide music into 10-year chunks, but it isn't like this whole generation dies. I mean, musicians play through those periods. And so you start having weird things that, you know, for example, when Alan Freed, who invented the term rock and roll, had the first rock and roll television program, Alan Freed's Rock and Roll House Party. The house band was the Count Basie Orchestra. And that's the sort of thing that's just like every history I had ever read suggested that rock and roll destroyed jazz, not that it put Count Basie on national television weekly. So, I mean, it was just things like that that just were completely counter to how I had always read the history, but that in fact, if you read the trade magazines, was the reality straight through. There's always more continuity than there is change, even in revolutionary periods.
Right, and you mentioned that you came from a working musician background. What exactly, where did you start out as?
I played guitar. I played mostly on the folk scene, playing acoustic blues, fingerstyle blues, and other stuff because I wanted to eat, you know. And that's a lot of, I have to say, the mentality that informs both this book and Escaping the Delta, my book on Robert Johnson, is sort of most people write about music as art, and most pop musicians don't have the luxury to be making art most of the time. What they're mostly making is a living, if they're lucky.
Yeah, if they're lucky. You know, you said that, you know, most musicians approach it as art. And you see it as making money. I mean, is that how you see it directly?
No, it isn't that. I mean, most writers approach it as art because that's what endures. I mean, most people writing about the music of the 20s now are writing about what's still worth listening to, which is our opinion now in 2010. So Louis Armstrong is of more interest than Guy Lombardo. And I don't disagree with that for a minute. But once you've written that book 50 times, people start talking about, and of course the most popular jazz artist of the 1920s was Louis Armstrong, which is simply wildly untrue. Guy Lombardo was the most popular jazz artist. And everybody who reads the books will say, but I mean, Guy Lombardo didn't even play jazz. Well, except if you're reading what people were writing in the 1920s, they called that jazz, and he had the most popular band in America. So what I was trying to do was just write history rather than writing criticism.
Right. I mean, obviously you took a different perspective than, you know, the normal book about, you know, the Beatles or the rock and roll history. Is that exactly what you wanted to accomplish, a fresh perspective, or did you just want to learn yourself about it?
Well, I wanted to learn about it myself, and yeah, I wanted people to buy the book. And for that, you need a fresh perspective. I mean, you need to give people something a little bit different. And I mean, the title is obviously a come on. I mean, the title is obviously designed to make people pick up the book. But, I mean, it's funny when obviously you put out a book called How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll, you get a certain number of people who just hate you without even picking up the book. I mean, go and check out any of my YouTube videos and you'll find that, how could this guy have done, anyway. And for a while when people would say, how can you say the Beatles destroyed rock and roll? I would try to, form an intelligent response. And after a while I just started saying, find someone, it could be someone in your family, whatever, find someone who was playing in a dance band in 1963 and ask them what my title means. And they may start their answer with, I love the Beatles, but everyone who was playing in a rock and roll dance band in 1963 can tell you what my title means, because the Beatles ended the business. They were the apocalypse. For those guys.
Right. Well, saying that, in the prologue to your book, you talk about, listening to the Beatles as a kid. How do you feel about them, now after doing all this research and, learning about this through this book?
This is going to sound utterly stupid, but, music historians are no different from anybody else. Mostly music has associations in our mind. And honestly, I feel about the Beatles exactly like I felt when I was 6 years old. My opinions have not changed an iota. And I don't say that with pride. I don't say that with shame. It just happens to be true. I think the high point of the Beatles is I Want to Hold Your Hand. And that record sounds as good to me now as it sounded to me in 1965. And Sgt. Pepper still sounds like grown-up music, not like what I want to go to the Beatles for.
Right. Well, and you were talking about how, the Beatles destroying rock and roll was them, destroying, people in a dance band. Most rock musicians disdain dance music. They don't really like it, but you see it as a support system for rock music, right?
All musicians, by and large, disdain dance. I mean, basically, people become musicians because they dance. Basically, men become musicians because they want to get laid and can't dance well. That's the essential reason. I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's not far off. It's an alternative to dancing. It's a way to be the life of the party without being a good dancer. And it doesn't work. The good dancers are still getting laid more. So, you hate them. That's one of the oversimplifications. My other oversimplification would be, musicians and critics and so forth, by and large, are nerdy guys locked in their bedroom without dates all through high school. And they hate the popular kids. And that's the way most pop music histories are written. Most pop music histories are about the music that should have been popular, but instead people were listening to all that crap. And I just wanted to write the other thing, the history of what in fact was popular music. And I mean, you know, I was one of those nerdy guys locked in my bedroom with my record collection. I'm not insulting other people. I'm simply describing who we are, who tend to write books about pop music. And it just, you know, it isn't that I love now the stuff the popular kids were listening to, but it is the history of what happened. And what I liked isn't the history of what happened. It profoundly isn't the history of what happened.
So do you think that rock and roll needed dance music?
Rock and roll was dance music. I mean, everyone agrees that rock and roll was dance music. That's all it was. I mean, it was music for teenagers to dance to. And the reason the Rolling Stones held on as long as they did was they kept making music for teenagers to dance to. I mean, there was this very, very funny interview in Rolling Stone, I think on the 20th anniversary of the Rolling Stones. They interviewed all 5 Stones, and they interview Mick Jagger, and he's, you know, at some point in the interview he says, you know, I mean, really, we were just making music for teenagers to dance to. And then they interview Keith and say, well, you know, we asked Mick, and he said, you were just making music for teenagers to dance to. And Keith says, well, what did you think we were doing? And I mean, that's why they held on. I mean, they had that tiny moment with their Satanic Majesty's Request and Beggar's Banquet where they tried to, you know, sort of follow the Beatles into pretentiousness. And then they went back to It's Only Rock and Roll, But I Like It. And we all went, oh, that isn't as good as their previous stuff, but it sold a lot more records. And that's what, you know, that's what that particular game is about.
And obviously the Stones, you know, had a giant blues influence to start with, you know,
Sure.
or so they said.
No, they were a blues band.
Right, and so, and you've obviously written a book on Robert Johnson. How do you see the blues in relation to rock and roll?
Depends what blues and what rock and roll.
Right.
I mean, the Stones reinvented blues. The Stones walked into a world where the most popular blues singers were, you know, B.B. King, Bobby Bland, Dinah Washington still, and they turned everyone towards Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. I personally agree with them. That's the stuff I love. But it completely reshaped the way rock people think about blues. I mean, rock people think of the history of blues going back from the Rolling Stones. You know, Rolling Stones to Muddy Waters to Robert Johnson to Charlie Patton, which were all reasonably minor figures in the history of blues, unless where you're going to is the Rolling Stones, which is a perfectly legitimate place to go to. But, I mean, no one in African American culture would trace a history of blues, would have traced a history of blues that way before the Stones.
Do you think that's a good thing that the Stones changed the reception, or?
It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing. It's a thing. I mean, if you like it, it's a good thing. One of the interesting things that's happened now is that since some women, specifically some black women, have had some power, we've had the Queen Latifah blues album, which is a complete Dinah Washington tribute album. And we have Christina Aguilera doing her Dinah Washington stuff. And suddenly there is a world where that part of blues, which was the mainstream of blues in the 40s and 50s, is finally getting some long overdue recognition. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? If you like it, it's a good thing. If you don't, it's a bad thing.